Welcome, everyone, to the December agenda review meeting. A couple of things I'd like to mention. We have a Christmas party Thursday from 6 to 9:30 or 6 to whenever. Come drop in. I hope everybody can make it. Secondly, please, I encourage each commissioner when they send out if you're going to make it to the agenda review or to the Thursday meeting, please respond. We're having challenges getting responses back, so it just helps staff plan if we'll all respond. At this time, I'll turn it over to Director Brooks.
Thank you, Chairman. I just have a few updates that I wanted to share with you all. They're mainly project updates. So Advanced Knox, hopefully you all have seen the Growth Policy Coordinating Committee has been meeting. They've had 2 meetings so far. They have another meeting coming up on Tuesday, December 19th at 5 p.m. in the main assembly. Committee members at that time will not be taking a vote, but they will continue to take public comments. And we'll keep you all posted when the next meeting where they will be voting will be scheduled. We have updated our FAQs on the Advanced Knox website, so I encourage you all to take a look at those. They do include questions that have come in over the last few weeks related to the growth policy plan, and we've tried to clarify for the public what the growth policy plan is, what it means, and how it relates to the new comprehensive land use and transportation plan that hopefully you all will be considering after the new year. The Mobility Plan 2050 update is now underway. Staff shared a survey with all of you all. I hope you all took a couple minutes to take that. It'll remain live for a little bit longer here. And we also have an interactive web map where you can add comments directly to the map by zooming into the areas. You can even get down to the street level or even specific intersections. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's at knoxmobility.org/feedback. And if you all would like for me to, I can send you out a link to that directly. We have a new project that we've just recently kicked off with the city's Office of Sustainability. It's called BREATHE, and it stands for Building Resilience Emissions Accounting Tactics for a Healthier Environment. This project is funded by the EPA. It's through the EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. And the focus of this project is identifying and evaluating activities that can reduce emissions across different sectors of our community. Planning's role in this will focus on public outreach and community engagement with our regional partners, primarily through that TPO function that we administer. And we will share that website once we have it updated. And that's it for my updates for today. We can go ahead and get into the agenda items if Lindsay is ready. I'm going to kick this off. So we're going to start off with agenda number 5, which is the City of Knoxville's proposed amendments related to middle housing. And as you all recall, this item was postponed in October to allow for additional public engagement, which has happened by Ms. Cheryl Ball. She's led that on behalf of the city. We've done some testing of the standards, and we've also conducted a peer review. And we shared most of those findings with you all at the workshop that we held. I'm grateful for those of you who were able to attend that, and if those who were not, hopefully you're able to watch the video. The body was also asked by City Council to consider the inclusion of RN1 in the proposed middle housing standards. So Lindsay will touch on that. And as requested by the commission, staff were asked to consider 2 zoning ordinance amendment proposals in conjunction with the city's proposal on middle housing. Those are items 6 and 7 on the agenda, submitted by Mr. Marlowe. And after careful consideration again of those proposed amendments, staff's recommendation remains the same as what was presented in October. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay to walk you through the changes.
Okay, so as Amy said, this is the City of Knoxville's code amendments to enable middle housing. I think it has to move. This case was postponed at the October meeting, which gave us the opportunity for a workshop in November 2023. That allowed us to provide context, so to step back and give that thorough sort of what, why, and how overview, and also to unpack some of the major topics of discussion from the October meeting. Can y'all hear me? Is that okay?
know if this has anything to do with it, if that's like the volume for it or something.
What about that? Is this okay? I feel like it creates static if we move it, but okay. I'll just move closer. So again, that workshop provided us the opportunity to give context and also to unpack some of the concerns that were discussed in the October meeting. So I would encourage anybody who missed that workshop or the October meetings to review that recording. For your reference and ease of access, Amy sent an extensive follow-up email on November 17th. So that's a date you may want to search in your inbox if you want to go back to some of that information. That was 11/17. And we can also reshare the recording of that workshop. We shared results of an extensive testing of the proposed code by planning staff, but there was also a semester-long studio by the UT School of Architecture, which you may have seen some of the images in the news lately, and that was really beneficial to this process. We completed that peer review on other municipalities, and then the city of Knoxville shared the results of their really extensive community engagement. So here in agenda review, I'm just going to go through the code section again. If some of y'all feel like you haven't heard enough about this, and some of you have probably heard way too much, let Amy or myself know, and we'll provide those resources to make sure you have all of that. So just a real brief summary, middle housing, the concept again, that's house scale buildings in multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. So to enable middle housing, that successful kind of form of housing, it's compatible with houses on the block. It's comprised of multiple smaller units, so multiple people can live there, and it's located in neighborhoods where the infrastructure supports. This code takes that and contains dimensional and design standards, offers opportunity for additional housing units, and it focuses on a specific area. So the areas that are identified as ideal for middle housing are walkable, they have smaller block lengths, a well-connected street network, nearby services, and then access to transit and lots with alleys. That's in comparison to neighborhoods that are typically not as appropriate for middle housing, that are more automobile oriented. So drawing on that, we'll jump into the code. The initial section lays out the specific location where this is applicable. So responding to that ideal for middle housing concept, the area that's applicable is the traditional neighborhood residential land use area, the TDR, and that's called out on your map. And then we have the zoning districts where this will apply, newly incorporating that RN1 zoning district. The TDR we found is really appropriate and aligns with that ideal for middle housing concept. It's characterized by neighborhoods with a mix of detached and attached houses, sidewalks, smaller lots, and alleys. And that's from our land use classification table. So that's something that's already ingrained in our long-range planning. We're not creating a new zone for this or a new area. We're working with something that's already ingrained in our systems. The code moves on to go through types. So those are definitions of each type of middle housing. There's emphasis on height, scale, and design features. These definitions may differ from the base zoning code, but we've created a new definition in section 2.3 that refers to this code. And so these types will apply only to middle housing types. Section 4.6.b goes through the permitted uses. So those are based on zoning district, type, and conformance to the standards that follow. That permitted use plus staff review, that aligns it with other precedents that we already have for development review, the EN zoning district, the DKE, and the RN4. So there is precedent for this type of planning staff review of development. We have, standardized application forms and required supporting documentation, and we'll have a real clear process for this review, similar to the systems we already have in place. We move to dimensional standards. So overall, these are standards are intended to encourage house scale buildings with a lower perceived density. So their footprints and the overall buildings are similar to single family houses, and the building heights are not going to be taller than the context. Another major element here is that the standards will regulate the available housing type by lot width. So using the lot width instead of lot area means that these housing types can fit on existing lots without the need to combine lots and create really large lots that don't fit in with that streetscape. These would maintain the existing pattern of the street while accommodating additional housing units. So there's a table, that's table 4.3. It establishes the dimensional standards by which the middle housing types are approved. They supersede the dimensional standards in table 4.1 of the residential code. And these standards regulate minimum lot width, both with and without an alley. So that's acknowledging the possible need for a driveway access on the side, a maximum building width and depth, setbacks, and height. In this section, there are also definitions for building width and depth, so review of the building footprint is consistent across all of the types. And then there are standards for dormer size and placement. And again, the aim here is just to keep whatever is built in scale with the neighborhood. We have parking standards in 4.6D. So where applicable, these will supersede the off-street parking requirements in Table 11.12. In general, it's a one space per dwelling unit. Obviously, builders, developers, people working with these properties have the option to provide more should they want, but it's a one space per dwelling unit minimum. There are reduced landscape buffers, and then there are location criteria, one goal of which is to ensure that the front yards aren't taken up by parking. And it just encourages parking in the interior side or rear yards and access by an alley when an operable alley is present. There are standards related to design. So their front-facing garages and front yard circular driveways are not permitted in general because those are not garage and parking standards that are seen already in these neighborhoods. There are design standards as well. So the intention here is just, again, to generate new buildings that are similar in footprint, height, and placement to the context, but allow for flexibility in design. So some of the image examples on these slides, that is from the infill housing design guidelines, and some of them are good and bad examples of how of existing neighborhoods and how new construction can fit into that. So the standards have to do with roof lines, with walls. We're trying to avoid, large swaths of siding, ensuring there are breaks and large massings. There's a list of design elements from which applicants can choose. And again, these are relatively simple. They're things that would most likely be included in a house anyways. And then there are standards for orientation to the street. There are standards for conversion in 4.6.f. This is a tactic here to really incentivize and support use of our existing housing stock in these neighborhoods. So buildings can be converted to middle housing types via interior renovation or addition, and the available types would correspond with Table 4.3, so that's which type is permitted in which zoning district. There are relatively simple design standards there, typically associated with just placement of additions with height and scale. And this was an element that was discussed pretty heavily in the Planning Commission meeting. So I did want to hit a few of those high points that we discussed at the workshop for folks that weren't there. One of the notes is this is already permitted in the base zoning via the special use process in several cases. However, it has fewer design guardrails and more parking requirements. So for example, in the RN1 or the RN2, a single family house can already be converted to a duplex through the special use process. But outside of the middle housing standards, they may be able to achieve this by, say, a two-story addition on a one-story house, or other elements that might be incompatible with the streetscape, and they'd have to add at least 2 parking spaces. Another note to this is now officially supported by federal historic preservation policy. So the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is the federal group that oversees historic preservation policy, they really specifically reference this, and they say it's a way to increase density without demolition, including in historic neighborhoods and historic districts. And so we've shared that paper with y'all, but I'm happy to resend it if folks need it. And then we wanted to just note that contemporary building codes are in play here. So this is intended to ensure safety, but also it may make conversion to 3 or more units a little bit more challenging. So that may end up in the prevalence of duplexes in some instances. But these were things that were discussed in the commission meeting, and we unpack it a little bit further in the workshop. So y'all can also review that information. 4.6.e, this is a section that we revised the title of, and I'll go to the revisions that are made in a following slide, but these are the various guardrails around this process. So administrative variations, variances, and appeals. Administrative variations can be granted by planning staff as part of the review process. So this is relief from certain standards based on existing conditions on the site. So provided that the lot meets the intent, the other dimensional and design standards, and is compatible in scale with the block face, there can be a 20% or up to a 20% reduction in lot width, corner side setbacks, and then also design standards with the aim to achieve a creative architectural design. One element that we've revised in this after some legal input, and I'll let Amy and Tasha unpack this further if folks have questions, but variances may be sought from the middle housing standards if a legal hardship exists. So this is an existing process, and that same process could be followed from the middle housing standards. Then we have a note in there about appeals. So this is a staff approval or denial. Those could be appealed to the Planning Commission. Again, these are an existing process. So there are a good deal of guardrails here for both applicants and community members or folks with concerns. But one thing we also wanted to note is that these middle housing standards are voluntary. Applicants can always opt to follow the base zoning in the special use review process too. So the Planning Commission would see those as usual. We have some associated minor amendments in the code, and I'm not going to run through all of these, but these are basically just minor text amendments to sort of correct table numbers, shift things around, and address the use matrix and principal use standards. So some of the revisions since the previous submission, these are in your case file in section 4.6, and it's the elements called out in red. And we can go through any of those that anybody has questions or concerns about. But really, in general, these are relatively minor revisions to definitions, to some of the dimensional standards and the parking, and a lot of that is based on internal testing. So Samuel in our office went through and used SketchUp to model these forms on typical lots, and we identified some minor kind of design and dimensional and then parking things that needed to be modified associated with that. We have added back in the existing parking reduction for properties within a quarter mile of a transit route. So that is also a possibility there in the parking section. Again, the capacity to apply for variances throughout the code is a revision since the previous submission. And then we've provided a recommendation on incorporating the RN1 zoning district pursuant to a request from City Council. So we can go back to that chart real quick. We have recommended incorporating the RN1 zoning district into duplexes here. And I just note that duplexes are already permitted in the RN1 zoning district via the special use process. And there is additional data on that request in the in the case file as well. So now I and Amy and we're all available to answer any sort of questions you guys might have.
Why did you only allow for duplexes in RN1? And how did you come up to that decision?
Well, that's a good question. Amy,
That's a great question. Duplexes are already allowed, as Lindsay stated, in the RN1 district, but they currently require a special use, and this would eliminate the special use requirement if they were to follow the middle housing types. And we felt like that would be appropriate first step in that particular zone.
Could you go back and explain to me within a quarter mile of that part of it, please, with the parking?
Yeah, so that is an existing element of the parking standards. I think it is section 11.4.b in the parking code citywide. And basically there is a, let's see, where's that image? A reduction in, is it 30% reduction in the parking that is required for a property if you are within a quarter mile of a transit route. So that's something that we, in looking at how we had modified the parking standards for these, saying only one space per dwelling unit is required. At first, in working through that, we thought, well, that's a pretty substantial reduction as is. But hearing additional commission and community feedback, we added that section back in there.
So I have a question about the, just even the study that was sent about density without demolition, the federal historical preventive. Does anything in this prevent someone from tearing down an existing single-family dwelling and building?
That's a good question. So no, the middle housing standards don't have anything new associated with demolition. Properties that are in a neighborhood conservation or a historic overlay, demolition of those houses or any buildings would be subject to Historic Zoning Commission review and approval. Our city also has a provision in the building code for demolition review. It's a 60-day demolition delay that may be enacted by the historic preservation planner. So right now that's me. If a property has local historic significance but doesn't have Historic Zoning Commission review, but these standards don't incorporate any additional demolition review in them right now.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you all look into accessible parking requirements any since our workshop, since that got brought up?
Yeah, so I have some input, and I know Brian is here as well, but I do have some information that he had provided. So just as a framework, Commissioner Higgins had brought up the fact that accessible parking is required when there are 4 units or more in a building, and how that can, create some conflicts or some additional challenges with site plans. You can see here our renderings, how some of the parking is laid out on these sites can get a little complicated. And again, I'm not going to speak for you, Brian, I'll let you talk too, but there are many variables within the building code that can change this, not necessarily requiring more parking, but possibly exempting those spaces. The building also says that where parking is provided, accessible parking spaces shall be provided. So that means if a 5-unit structure is built and it's required only 3 parking spaces, then one of those spaces would need to be accessible if building code requirements. So that's just to say, we did explore it. Right now, that is something that would still be required for buildings with that number of units. But, there is some elements within the building code that could change that.
So is that to say that if you had 4 parking spaces required, like say you were building a quadplex and they had to be accessible, or there was an accessible space required, it could count as one of those 4? Okay.
I would defer to Mr. Berry.
We said yes.
Yeah, he said yes. Okay.
When this, can't tell if you can hear me. When this was brought up previously, and we were hearing it in our voting meeting, I asked that there be some component of the plan that include a review for a year out. Just because there's been so much attention to it, it would be fantastic to have the opportunity, codified that we come back and look at it. Is there anything, and I think Director Brooks, you answered my question, but I cannot remember what you said at that point.
I'm not sure that I remember exactly what I said either during that workshop, but yes, that is our intent to do that. If we need to put something more explicit, we're happy to do that, and that's something that can be made part of a motion if you all were to approve this.
Yeah, we also, in part of the peer review, we have a lot of examples of other municipalities that provide that type of reporting, whether it's monthly, biannually, annually, et cetera. So there are a lot of precedents for that type of reporting that we could use.
Lindsay, could maybe walk us through that 30% reduction of parking and maybe by type, and let's do the math. It sounds nice, but I'm not sure how much effect it has. So on a duplex.
Yeah, and have Mr. Berry come up as well.
I'm Brian Berry with City Plans Review and Inspections.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Tim.
Could you walk us through that and let's by type and let's see how how much parking is reduced by type based on the 30% reduction?
Sure. So I'd have to do some quick math here on
And I've
generally
put
what
up
we'd be looking at.
on the table the types there, if that helps you. So 2 units, 3, 4, and we can go through there.
So Lindsay, is there a table that's related to parking?
So we don't have a table related to the parking.
Remind me, what was the parking requirement?
One space minimum per
Per
unit.
unit?
So
Okay.
So if you take a duplex
Yeah.
and multiply 2 times 0.30,
Right.
that's 0.6. Now, how would you apply that?
So if it's 1.5 or greater, it's rounded up. And if it's 1.4 or less, it's rounded down. So if it ends up being 1.4, it would be 1 parking space required.
Okay. And then on a triplex, we would, just make sure we're doing the same thing here, times 0.30, so that would be 0.9, so you would get one reduction, one spot
Correct. You
reduction.
required 2 spaces.
And then on a fourplex, you would get 1.
Yes, I'll trust your math there and say,
It's 1.2, so
Okay.
rounding up.
yes, you're right.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Lindsay, can you discuss what the legal hardships would be in order to go for a variance?
I'm Christina Morgan-Stillery with the City Law Department. So hardships are both defined in our zoning code and laid out very clearly in case law that's already been decided. So hardships have to relate, what I always say is they have to relate to the dirt itself somehow. It has to be something like an irregularly shaped lot, the presence of a sinkhole, topography issues, things along those lines. Something that forces you to design something a little bit differently because of the character of the land itself.
So what if they come in and say, well, the lot's too small?
Well, we would generally not say that that is a hardship because that is something that is already a known characteristic of the property that may not be appropriate for this type of development. And that's why if you look in the section, the revised section about the variances, I'll read that first sentence there. The intent of Article 4.6 is to allow middle housing types which are in harmony with the character of the surrounding neighborhood and will not be injurious to it or to the public welfare. Therefore, variances which would allow developments which are larger scale, allow for greater density, or otherwise are out of character with the surrounding neighborhood are discouraged unless there is a legal hardship and all standards and requirements for variances are met as set forth in 16.3. So there's a discouragement of variances. And the reason why is because this particular use is a little bit more intense than, say, a single family home. So you might be able to do that on that small lot, but this may not be appropriate for that small lot. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, so it has to do something with the physical nature of the land.
Correct. Yes.
Not the dimensional standards of the land.
Correct. Yes.
Could you give us an example? Because I've heard at BZA before where when you request something, they say, well, that's development driven is the reason. And so that's not really a hardship. And it seems like you could argue that no matter what thing you brought to BZA, that you could say that's development driven if a single family home fits. But going to the middle housing, so I'm trying to think of what could be a hardship if they default to this is development driven and you can put a single family home on it.
I think it would be very difficult for someone to come up with a hardship as defined by case law and the zoning code. when you think about variances in general, it might be something like, trying to add a garage on a property, but you have to put it within the side setback because there's a sinkhole on the other side that's started. That's an obvious hardship, but you're exactly right. In terms of designing your own hardship is kind of how we phrase it. That is absolutely something that probably would come up in any request to have this particular development along with a hardship request, so.
What if the lot, everything worked for, let's say, the number of units and the structure, but then the parking, for whatever reason, you weren't able to get that? Is there potential for a hardship there that isn't, what did you say, a designed hardship?
So there is they would have to make a hardship request. They would have to show that there is some kind of hardship and that it was not designed that way. Yeah.
Since it's not about the density or the number of units or anything like that, would that be, I guess in that situation, you could still say, well, single family house wouldn't have this problem. But if you meet all the standards to do missing middle and you just have this accessory issue, maybe it's not wide enough to do the parking required and you need a variance on the parking. Do you think that the default would be, well, do a triplex or a single family, or do you think that there could be a hardship argued for the parking?
So each piece of property is really different. It would really be fact dependent on the case coming before the BZA. But I think generally that if it is design driven and, scaling back the massing of the building or the density would then allow for the parking, I think the applicant would have a really high burden to try to meet. Okay. Thank you.
I've got a question. I'm trying to find, so the quarter-mile transit parking reduction, where in the missing middle code does it link that to that reduction that's in another part of our existing code, right?
So we did not link it directly. In the revisions in the proposal that was reviewed in October, we had specifically stated that section does not apply. And we've removed that section. So now that does apply.
So the parking standards supersede all other parking standards.
Not necessarily.
Except for that.
In the code, it says where applicable, the parking standards in 46D supersede off-street parking requirements in Table 1112.
Okay. So, and then when it comes to, a one spot per unit requirement, so Opticos recommended no more than one. Having more than one is what they cited as a barrier to missing middle developments. So how did we arrive at one?
So I might defer to my city colleagues here. I think after some discussion, not all of the recommendations were followed to the T from Opticos, and you all probably are aware of this at this point. I don't know if Ms. Ball would like to speak to the one space per unit.
Sure, I'll be happy to. Cheryl Ball, City of Knoxville. Our current code requires 2 parking spaces per unit. It's a lot. And so our team, which involves half planning staff, half city staff, really wanted to be a little more progressive than that, a little more supportive of not just what the concept of missing middle is, but the report that we received from Opticos. And so we decided cutting that by half was a good start. Just a quick reminder, I know that this stat is probably not embedded in your brain, but it is in some of ours. But we've shared it with you a couple of times. 40.8% of Knoxville households have a single person living in them. 40.8 have one person living in the home. And so we felt like that also supported reducing the parking by 50%, basically, from what our standard code recommends, and coupling that with the Opticos recommendations. And then we were really pleased to, most recently, as Lindsay said, go back and put that additional 30% reduction if you're within a quarter mile of transit back into the plan. Does that help answer?
That's answer.
Thank you.
And then to follow up on that, from the other cities that have put in some missing middle housing reforms, how many parking spots per unit have they been looking at doing?
I would say it depends.
Yeah.
It's across the board, and I think in some municipalities that have done broader programs have removed all parking requirements associated with these. However, other municipalities have scaled it based on proximity to transit, proximity to corridors. So I don't think I could give you a specific number on that. But the spreadsheet that we shared that had the results of our peer review, it should have information on the parking reductions in the municipalities we researched. So if there's a direction that you'd be interested in, we can definitely refer you to that kind of information. But in general, I think it differs depending on the municipality, the level of changes they were looking to make, and then also locations within that city.
And then also I'll just add to that and keep in mind the level of transit service that those particular communities might have.
Yeah.
Do we know if the city's ever looked at off-street parking inventory, for lack of a better word? Has that ever been, like, what is the capacity of our streets?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm not aware of any citywide study that's ever been undertaken. I know that there is a parking study, maybe for a smaller portion of the city. Is that correct? Downtown, that they are currently going to be undertaking.
Thanks.
I think my question is more of a procedural one. When this was, so it might be for Tasha, but as this came through originally in October in one form, and now it's significantly changed, adding R1, changing a lot of the things in it. I mean, when a motion is made, if there is a motion made, I mean, is it, I guess I'm thinking of like a zoning that came through and it's changed, and there's an application made, and now it's different. Since it was already in the system, in the queue, if you will, I mean, or does it, if you made a motion, would it be for the one in October, or is it the one that would be in front of us today? It's the one that's in front of us today. So the motion that gets made covers all the new, everything that was invited.
Subject to any discussion.
Right.
Or revisions, yeah.
Right. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Would there ever, excuse me, would there ever be a time where there would be no parking required? Just a question.
Planning Commission certainly has the opportunity and ability to incorporate that in the proposal, in the code amendments.
Well, you said other cities, some of them had parking restrictions, some of them don't.
Yes.
What have been the obstacles on the cities that don't have parking restrictions?
What do you mean by obstacles?
Have they had issues by not having parking? Because I look at it that if I'm going to build a triplex, and if there's a bunch of parking around, I might not put parking in. But if there wasn't any parking around, I wouldn't be able to sell it or rent it without parking. And I don't know if that's regulating or whether, I just think common sense would put the right amount of parking spaces. But you all did it longer than me. Is there common sense?
Well, I'll say I think there hasn't been a lot of because so many of these code amendments that other municipalities have made are relatively recent, there's not, what we found is that there hasn't been a lot of data shared on that kind of information. So I don't know that we have a lot of info on obstacles that have been created, but I do think you bring up a very good point that anyone building these properties has the capacity and opportunity, if the lot allows it, to provide more parking for people.
I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up because that's the only thing that's puzzling me with this. I mean, I'm all for it, but you'd have so much more green space too. You know, I mean, we can have roads ourselves to death, you know.
Yeah.
But parking's parking. If you need it, you need it. But I just would love to have an idea of what would not require parking somewhere down the line.
And I'd say you can kind of, the testing that was provided or completed by our staff and provided, you can see, Samuel based these on standard dimensions that engineering uses. So you can see how these are laid out in the testing document, like what these parking areas could look like as proposed currently.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rich, I go back to, I know I've referenced this a couple of times, so you're probably tired of hearing it. The urban overlay zone in Nashville, Tennessee, they have no parking requirements. And just on my observation, it looks like it works very well. And they only do that in the TDRs.
I wanted to kind of tag on to what Tim was saying, that two things. One, what you're raising is why I want very much there to be if this moves forward, a time period where we look at what worked, what didn't, how do we keep making this the best that it can be? And that could be an area where the parking gets assessed again. But it was at a Keep Knoxville Beautiful event a couple of months ago where there was someone from their planning department or working on their zoning that was talking about the removal of parking minimums and the effect in a positive way that had brought. So I think there are a couple of examples just today that we've got, but I think being able to assess that after a period of time and really see what is happening now would be good.
If we already are reducing the parking requirements within a quarter mile of a public transit, I mean, I'm not a math whiz, admittedly, everybody, but the math I heard, you're essentially it's possible that you would be taking away a spot from an entire unit anyway. So, and I'm sorry if you've answered this, but within the quarter mile of public transit, I assume that the rationale is that those people can get to public transit. So I guess why didn't we just remove the parking requirement? And maybe this goes to Tim's point of the urban overlay within the quarter mile. And then everybody else, I understand we need parking. I'm sorry if I'm repeating everything, but I'm trying to just kind of tie a bow on it.
That's a good point. We hadn't included that in our proposal, but again, that's something that is within the Planning Commission's capacity to address.
And another thing that I think will be good to do, and maybe we do it Thursday, is inquire about the testing of these properties to see what were the biggest barriers. Because what I took from Opticos was parking is the biggest barrier.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you all. Commissioner Adams had a couple questions about another item that we didn't have on the agenda. And if you would still like to ask those questions, I was going to suggest that we move to that item. It's item number 8. It's another ordinance amendment submitted by the City of Knoxville. If that's okay with everyone. And we have Miss Liz Albertson here. So if you have any specific questions, I'm sure she'd be able to answer them. And we were not prepared for an actual presentation on this one. But Liz, do you want to come up and just give a brief overview?
Yes, thank you. I'm Liz Albertson with the City of Knoxville, and I wanted to briefly go over the South Waterfront and Form-Based Code amendments that are before you this time. So if you remember previously, back in October, there were also some amendments that came forward related to establishing standalone surface parking lot landscaping requirements in the Form-Based Code District for the South Waterfront, as well as limiting variances on transparency requirements for ground floor transparency also within these more commercial areas of the South Waterfront. So those amendments were passed at the November 28th November 28th City Council meeting. So they're now adopted and part of the code. But this is the second round of revisions that are coming forward. So this is changes to the Level 3 alternative compliance review language for the form-based code districts. And just to sort of remind everyone, I've handed out a summary of the process improvements for the South Waterfront area. The city has been working technically since January of last year, January of this year, 2023, to revise some things related to the Board of Zoning Appeals, particularly with the South Waterfront. There had been a number of concerns from the community where people felt that they were not made aware of some of the variances that were being applied for in the South Waterfront District. So to help meet some of those concerns, in January of 2023, the sign posting requirement for the Board of Zoning Appeals within the city was actually codified. That was a practice that had already been happening, but now it is part of the public noticing that's required for all of the form-based code districts, so both South Waterfront and Cumberland Avenue. The advisory group that was established as well back in January of 2023, a resolution was adopted by the City Council asking for there to be an advisory group that studies the South Waterfront and provides some recommendations. So that group met approximately 5 times. There were about 12 participating community members, and several actions have taken place because of the recommendations from that group. So I just want to let you know that the work is not done with this process. We are still continuing. This will probably not be the last round of revisions you'll see before you, but we are going to continue the work with a larger group. So right now we have a group of about 12 members. The group with the advisement of Councilman Smith, as well as some other community members, is expanding into more of an advocacy and advisory group that will continue looking at development in the South Waterfront and making recommendations for how we can better improve that process. So just wanted to let you know that these are the changes that are before you now, and we feel like we're heading in a really great direction. So if you have any questions, particularly about these amendments, please let me know, or the process overall. But I think this document that I've handed out will summarize sort of how we've gotten to where we are.
Thank you, Liz. That helps me understand how this complements what we're looking at for the meeting on Thursday.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Do you want me to take it? Okay. Now we're going to move on to agenda item number 6. And Whitney will cover this one. '26.
Okay.
Okay. This is a rezoning request from the Business and Technology Park.
Whitney, can you pull your mic down a little bit? Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. This is a rezoning request from Business and Technology Park with a technology overlay to planned residential up to 12 dwelling units an acre with a technology overlay. This was approved or recommended for approval last night at the TTCDA board. It's 9.88 acres on Bob Gray Road and Pellissippi Parkway. The PR zone at 12 dwelling units an acre is consistent with the MDRO land use classification in the Northwest County Sector Plan, which allows consideration of up to 12 dwelling units an acre in the county's planned growth area. There is a blue line stream at the rear of this property, and the 2.4 acres are within the hillside protection area, so the flexibility of the PR zone makes it an appropriate zone to consider. At a density of 12 dwelling units an acre on this 9.88 acre site, a maximum of 118 units could be built. Houses, duplexes, and multi-dwelling structures and developments are permitted in the PR zone. And in the past 40 years, there has been a significant amount of BP and technology overlay zone rezonings to planned residential and technology overlay in this area. And the PR zone at a density of 12 dwelling units an acre would be an extension of the zone to the south. The site has direct access to Bob Gray Road, which is a major collector. The adjacent property to the south, Parkway Heights, has direct access to Pellissippi Parkway via a private road. Due to safety considerations, TDOT has stated they would be in favor of closing this private street connection to Pellissippi upon development of this property, including a sub-out connection. So the staff recommendation is to approve the PR zone with up to 12 dwelling units an acre, with one condition requiring a stub-out to Parkway Heights, the subdivision to the south, with the location and design to be approved by the Planning Commission during development plan review. Any questions?
I just have a question about it's not specific to this development, but it is in general the road plan in that area. Can you speak to what that is?
So there's no official plan, but there were presentations done by TDOT in, I believe, 2017, talking about closing a lot of access points along Pellissippi Parkway. And so this road, the Odin Street connection, we asked them if they would be in favor of closing that, if a stub out was provided, and TDOT said yes.
And I don't have a specific answer to that question, but I do know that a TDOT representative presented this morning that they are looking at Pellissippi Parkway. There's a study going on, and they are reevaluating all the right-of-way along that corridor. All right. Thank you, Whitney. We're going to turn it over to Samuel for agenda item number 16, which is 12 SB 23C. This is a request for a small 14-lot subdivision, but it does include one variance request to the subdivision regulations and two requests for alternative design standards that require your approval.
Can I do one thing?
Sure, absolutely.
Can I back up on this last one?
Yeah,
my little
absolutely.
gerbil trap didn't quite catch up to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to move too
No,
quickly.
you didn't. I just, the more I thought about it, so that access to Pellissippi Parkway is not great, and I get that, and I understand the benefit of requiring the stub street from the 12 to the new 12. Makes total sense. As you look at the access on Bob Gray for the new 12, there's not a whole lot of frontage there, and you've got the bridge abutment, and so there's not going to be a huge opportunity for improvements. And so my question is, if the developer for the new 12 is saddled with having to solve for the old 12's traffic, would it then limit the ability to develop the new 12 because of the traffic of the old 12 because their access is taken away? And who would contribute? And, because the developer's long gone, this is an old HOA, and they're obviously not going to be able to contribute financially to any improvement. So that can be a little bit challenging. So I'm just curious if there's too much loaded on that one piece that it just can't absorb, how do we deal with that?
That's a great question. Steve, do you have a?
That's a point I brought up when we were talking about the stub out is the traffic. If the traffic from the existing subdivision trips a turn lane, I think Knox County would be forced to participate and assist the developer in installing turn lanes or whatever road improvements would be necessary for their access. There's also access to the west from existing subdivision I think we would look at is when we get into the development plan stage.
That's a great question. Thank you.
Hello. Item 16 is a concept plan. This proposal is for a 14-lot subdivision for a single-family houses. The property is within the boundaries of Lonas Drive Community Association, which is located west of I-75 and north of I-40. It consists of 2 existing parcels along Lonas Drive, which is a major collector street. The property is also fronts Kimwatt Drive, local street. The eastern parcel is zoned RN2. Planning Commission approved the RN2 district for the western parcel in November. It is still pending City Council approval. Here is an aerial view of the property. As you can see, it surrounded by single-family houses, but there are some multifamily developments to the east. Here is a site plan rotated in order to maximize the screen. The property will have access via Lonas Drive. 2 private roads are proposed as part of the development, Nathan's Cove and the hammerhead is named Nathan's Springway. This concept plan includes a variance request for reduction of the minimum intersection separation from Nathan's Cove Way and to Charlie Way from 300 feet to 125 feet as marked at the bottom of the image. It also requests for 2 alternative design standards, reduction of the minimum right-of-way width and reduction of the minimum pavement width of the private right-of-way. Staff recommends approval of the variance because of the topography and location of the property with respect to the adjacent streets. The entire property is less than 300 feet from Charlie Way, so it's impossible to meet the requirement along Lonas Drive. It is equally challenging to provide access from Kimwatt Drive because of grade changes and potential site distance issue due to the horizontal curve of Kimwatt Drive. Here you can see a couple of pictures of Kimwatt Drive looking east, and Lonas Drive looking east. If you can see, well, you don't see my mouse pointer, but the Charlie Way intersection can be seen from the proposed entrance along Lonas Drive. We are recommending approval of the alternative design standards as supported by engineering. One of the conditions of the concept plan approval is certifying the site distance before grading permits are issued for this site. Any questions?
So it's a private drive. They don't have to have, there's no sidewalk plan on this, right?
To my knowledge, they're not required to.
Question for me is, but for the topography and the frontage issue, I guess, would we otherwise require them to connect to Kimwatt Drive?
Yes, if Kimwatt Drive had a better site distance and no topographical issue, the engineering and the developer could likely look into that. However, this came up and discussed, and everyone thought that it's better to have access from Lonas Drive. Charlie Way is also a local street, and it has relatively low traffic volume, and this subdivision of 14 lot will likely have low traffic volume, so no left turn conflicts are anticipated. And beside the left turn conflict, I think there are adequate site distance. The engineer or the applicant has provided that, but the engineering department has requested that they reevaluate the site distance, and that's why we're adding that as part of the condition.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, seeing no more questions, we'll move on to item number 22. This one received a fair number of public comments. Samuel?
So this property is located in the East County adjacent to the Ramsey House. The access is via Governor John Sevier Highway, a major arterial street. The request is to go from A and OS to CA and GC. The applicant is also requesting removal of the SG overlay. The request is for the 2.5 acre portion of the 5.77 acre parcel. So the blue highlighted portion is the rezoning boundary, but the rectangular portion at the back on the east side is also included as part of the parcel, but it's not included as part of this rezoning application. The properties adjacent to PC zone and agricultural zone. There are industrial zone properties across the highway. The requested CA zones does exist nearby to the north along the corridor. The adjacent PC zone property is actually a Dollar General. The existing land use shows that much of that industrial zone properties is used as commercial and offices across the highway. The agriculture zone to the north is actually a rural residence. Along Governor John Sevier Highway, only the subject property has the OS classification, and the proposed GC land use will be a minor extension from south. Here is an aerial image. You can see that this is a heavily vegetated parcel. There are existing wetlands, but the boundaries of the wetlands have not been determined. The plat identifies the wetland on the corner of the adjacent parcel. If you see the hatched area in the middle of that plat, but it was never determined for the whole parcel. It is to be noted that the applicant has requested the Historic Zoning Commission for removal of the SG overlay from the entire property in October, but the HEC has denied the request. The applicant has revised the boundary for this rezoning application, so it does not include the whole boundary, as I mentioned earlier. Staff recommends the approval of the CA zone and GC land use because it's compatible with the surrounding area, including the commercial uses nearby, subject to 3 conditions. Staff recommends to deny the removal of the SG overlay as recommended by SGC. The conditions include determining the wetland boundary, and any disturbance on that site would be subject to the Knox County Stormwater Ordinance, Section 26.223(2). We're also recommending providing a 50-foot buffer along the front. This is consistent with the John Sevier Highway Corridor Studies recommendation for a 50-foot buffer of tree preservation and replacement. And any advertising signage shall be limited to 100 square feet as regulated by the Scenic Parkway regulations. Happy to answer any questions.
Sonal, I have a question. Can you go back to the map that shows back another one, I think. My question is about the area that's sort of a long rectangle that's not being developed.
Yes, so that is not part of this rezoning application, and I think there are wetlands. It's going to be difficult to develop anyway. But again, the boundary of the wetland has never been determined. So they may be able to develop some of it, but that is not part of this rezoning application.
Okay, thanks.
Samuel, is the intent of the square footage for the sign for an advertising sign or business sign?
I think it's
'Cause advertising to me says billboard, business is like for the business, so I don't know what the intent there is for the wording of that.
I actually copied the language from the Scenic Highway and Parkway regulation. It just says that advertising signs, but I'm not aware that it has been specified. However, the John Sevier Highway Corridor Study has some recommendation for signage. It discourages any pole sign or any billboard. But we have not added those conditions in here.
Okay. Was adopted.
So are you saying add on-premise signage instead of?
Yes, I think it should just say all signage.
On-premise signage?
Yes.
Yeah.
'Cause advertising to me indicates like
It could.
billboard type sign, not a business sign.
Did you hear that?
I did not.
You kids.
He was talking to me.
Go ahead.
We still got 2 weeks till
Go ahead.
Christmas.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was one of my most shining moments.
Well, replay it.
Codes and I think that you ought to specifically say that the signage is for on-premise signage, just so codes won't have to make a determination down the road as to what type of signage.
Okay.
You guys can go back to your regularly scheduled.
I was just going to ask Lindsay if she could talk about the impact to the property of the historic zoning overlay remaining.
Yeah. So the Historic Zoning Commission is charged with reviewing how the placement or the removal of a historic zoning overlay would affect the integrity of the overall site. And the concept of integrity is a preservation thing that involves setting as well as, not the overall property, not just the Ramsey house itself, which is pretty far away from that. So in October 2023, the Knox County Historic Zoning Commission determined that removing the historic zoning overlay from the entire parcel would have an adverse effect on the Ramsey house property, because the Ramsey house property doesn't just incorporate that house, but it incorporates the historic setting around it, which includes those wetlands areas, the woods, everything like that.
Thank you.
A follow-up question on the historical overlay. I guess the way you worded that, and I certainly wasn't in that meeting, but they're opposed to removing it from the entire parcel. Because, I mean, as I'm looking at it, certainly that back strip behind it should stay in it. But can you pull up that aerial, the aerial of it? I mean, if we're talking about historical, I mean, I see a bunch of trailers on that upper portion, right down the street, and a lot of commercial uses, some sort of apartments down on the other side, and a Dollar General is certainly not historical. But I'm just posing the question, I mean, would it even be a consideration to not have the historical overlay on the front part, but keep it on the back?
So that is the applicant's request. When he came to the Historic Zoning Commission, the map that Samuel has that shows that L shape, he requested to remove it from the entire one. And then based on the input from the Historic Zoning Commission, he has removed that section and submitted this request to you guys.
Okay, so who would have jurisdiction over that? I mean,
The Planning Commission.
okay. Do you know what the Historical Society would feel about that?
Well, I can definitely provide you their discussion because they did kind of go into it in depth. I think the discussion really just focused on removing it from the entire parcel. And so that includes the parcel that fronts John Sevier Highway.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to look at the discussion part if you could email that if it's possible. Just out of curiosity anyway, because it kind of makes sense to me to, everything on John Sevier, is just commercial. But it makes sense to me that the historical overlay needs to remain on the back. But I guess it just wasn't presented to the application wasn't made that way, so.
Right. And I'd just note on the historic zoning end, historic zoning on a property doesn't preclude development of any kind. It's just and it doesn't regulate use in any way. So even with the historic zoning overlay on the property, the developer could build something. They would just go through a design review related process.
Wasn't there something in the case file that sort of spoke to what you just said, that it's really there, the historic overlay is really there as a flag for groups like the Planning Commission to take note as they're making decisions?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
That would be one reason that I would be okay leaving it there, just to remain cognizant of what is around that parcel.
Yeah, and I'm totally okay with that. I mean, I guess my question is to reiterate. I mean, it doesn't restrict height, or I guess we were talking about signage. Does that have anything to do with historical overlay?
No, that would adhere to the base zoning. The design guidelines for this property are the basic overarching standards for historic preservation. They're called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehab. And basically, the intent is just for what is built on the site to be compatible and not detract from the adjacent site.
Thank you.
Lindsay, quick question, because I was at the historic meeting when this was discussed. So do they just make a recommendation to us? Okay.
Yes, they are not a ruling body on that. The Planning Commission is the one who makes the decision. They make a recommendation to you guys on how it may or may not affect the historic site.
I may have missed or misunderstood this, but did they make a recommendation on this version?
They made a recommendation on that version that's on the screen right now.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
One minor point of clarification, you were asking about the height. That's not guided by the HCC, but in this case, it's in the Governor John Sevier Highway Scenic Corridor by the state. It's designated by the state, and that does have a 35-foot height prohibition. So that's where that height comes into play, is from that. I believe so. I'd have to double check. Pull it up real quick.
Help me understand that, because what does that do? It sounds like it would protect certain things, but I see that junkyard that just popped up about 3 years ago. Does the scenic highway not prevent something like that from occurring?
It does have a prohibition on those sorts of things.
So it looks like the Governor John Sevier Highway was designated scenic highway in 1971 from the intersection of Alcoa Highway to the intersection of Chapman Highway.
So this is not the scenic part?
Correct.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it goes all the way to Asheville Highway, and it might be a different line in the
Oh, you're right. In 1982, excuse me, apologize for that. They designated the entire length of John Sevier Highway as part of the parkway system.
Yeah, we do have the scenic highway map layer in KGIS, and looking at it now, it does look like the entire thing is included in that buffer area.
So what protections does a scenic highway provide if we have junkyards?
I couldn't speak to how that got permitted. I'm not sure if maybe it just didn't get permitted. I would refer to my county
Or if it's
colleague
been there.
in that.
No, it hadn't been there.
Okay.
It's a scenic junkyard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that includes the ones that we've had identified to review today. Are there any other ones? Okay. Thank you. I think we're